My name is Raisa Belyavina. Thank you very much for indulging me with your time, and I hope with your feedback and your insights on my topic. A couple of words about me. I'm a PhD candidate at Columbia University Teachers College. I'm studying international education and education policy. I am also in the disciplinary focus of sociology. My previous background is political science with a focus on Eurasia, and I have also studied Russian language. I am a Russian heritage speaker. My interest in education stems from my various experiences and encounters in the education sphere around the world, both as a teacher, as a scholar, and as a student. This is roughly what I'm going to talk to you about today, but as you look at that, I just want to get a feel for who's in the room. And by the way, if there's anything you really want to ask me or clarify, please do interrupt. We are a fairly small group, so the more interaction, the better. I am a former teacher, so I believe in asking questions rather than holding off on something that can't wait. Just for understanding who's here, who here has studied and finished school in Kyrgyzstan? Whether it's higher education, basic education, great. Who has socialist countries, great. Who has children, family, or friends, children who are in Bishkek schools? Yeah? Has someone? Okay, so involved in the education sector. Does anyone teach or has taught in schools, whether in Bishkek or abroad, anywhere? Has taught at the basic level? Great, thank you. And does anyone here have teacher friends? Friends who are teachers in Bishkek? Yes? Okay, great. Knows teachers in the city? Yes? Wonderful. Does anyone here do research on teachers or on education? Research. So I know who my friends are, I know who my comrades are. Fantastic. So, an introduction on my research. So the motivation for my research, the motivation for my PhD work is very simple. I'm interested in a couple of questions. I'm interested in understanding who becomes a teacher. I'm interested in understanding who stays in the teaching profession. I'm interested in understanding who leaves the teaching sphere and why. And I'm interested in the implications that all of this has on national development. Yeah? Particularly, I'm interested in societies that have seen dramatic transformation. I'm interested in looking at the impact of social and economical transformation on societies and on the teaching profession specifically. So I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to come to Kyrgyzstan in 2014 when I was in my third year of the doctoral program, and to be part of a study assessing the situation of teachers in Kyrgyzstan. This was a UNICEF study, and we were looking at, specifically at the changing salary structure in the country. So this was a very technical report. It's been published. It's called The Situation Analysis of Teachers in Kyrgyzstan, Salary, Teaching Hours, and Quality of Instruction. And my work builds on this technical report and very technical analysis. But what I'm interested in now is not just looking at the technical aspects, although I am very interested in how the technical impacts the social. I'm very interested in updating some of the literature that exists on the Soviet stavka system and understanding how that has been modernized, how that has been contextualized. But I'm also, as a sociologist, interested in, again, in the impact of the technical and the sociological. So my questions are the sociological questions around reform impacts and the impacts that they have on societies, communities, schools, and teachers. So here are my research goals. I'm interested in investigating how global education policies are adopted at the local level, how they are contextualized, reframed, and ultimately whether they're adapted and adopted or whether they're rejected. I am continuing to analyze the impact of the 2011 structure reform on teachers. That is the core of my analysis, looking at the impact at the school level on teachers. I'm particularly interested in Bishkek. I'm also interested in understanding the evolution of the remuneration system in Kyrgyzstan. I'm interested in things like logic and processes of reform implementation. And I do want to contribute to understanding the trajectory of education financing and education reforms in the post-Soviet space. Lofty goals, but it is a dissertation. My advisor will not let me defend without, some things big and small. Here's my research question and some sub-questions. It does speak more to qualitative. It is a qualitative question, but I will also be doing quantitative analysis. So I'm interested in what ways entities, in this instance I'm looking at schools, I'm looking at teachers, the ways in which they experience reforms that they deem to be negative, and how do they react? How do they change those reforms that are seen as deleterious? So my sub-questions, they're sociological. What resources are used to change reforms? I say here educationalists, kind of an awkward noun, but I say this because I'm here talking about teachers, but I'm also talking about education administrators, so I'm including school principals, vice principals, and so on. I'm interested in agency, and I'm interested in the way that educators employ agency and the way that they leverage social capital, both within schools but also in communities. I'm very interested in understanding who the allies are of teachers, whether it's administrators, and in that case then, who are the allies of the administrators, again, both within schools but also outside of schools. And I'm interested in the interaction between policymakers and communities and how they respond to the actions of teachers in schools. And again, actions of teachers in schools when they want to change or modify reforms in some ways. So my motivation for my research study, I am of the conviction that education can be a great equalizer, that in societies that devote themselves to education, we see outcomes in the long term. I am, again, a former teacher. That's probably my favorite job in the world. So I believe in looking at what's happening in the education sector as an investigation and what's happening in the country. However, as a researcher, here's a motivation for my research as well. I want to show you a comparison of salaries of teachers in the Soviet era and in the post-Soviet era. So this is a calculation that an economist friend of mine helped me to do. And what we're looking at here is the trajectory of different professions in the Soviet time. So you've got everything ranging from construction to health and welfare and the education sector. So you can see in the 1940s, salaries in the Soviet Union were actually quite compressed, right? More or less equal. You can see that this differentiation of the salary grade really started to unfold within 40 years. And quite dramatically, you can say, but actually not too much, because the difference is still between, for the most part, between earning 150 rubles and 250 rubles. But you can see that from earning about 100% of what the national average is as teachers, over time, by 1986, we saw that teachers got to about 80% of the national teaching average. Yeah? So what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Well, what happened was, remarkably, a lot of the salaries were the same at the beginning transition, and then you can see how dramatically they became differentiated. And partially that's because a number of these sectors became private sectors, not public sectors. And this is, I suppose this is normal, but what we're looking at is understanding and seeing where the education sector has wound up. So we can see that in the slow trajectory here, by 2010, teachers were earning half of the national average. Yeah? So what this allows us to understand is why around 2010 in Kyrgyzstan you started to see a lot of protests, you started to see a lot of pressure on the government to understand and to take stock of where teachers are in an economic sense. Yeah? And I don't know if any of you who were here in 2010, if you remember in the news hearing about the teacher protests? Yeah? You did? Yeah? So this is a slide that I attribute to my advisor who also does research on post-Soviet education. Her name is CASI. So this is really the framework for why the time became ripe for this reform that unfolded in 2011. You had 2 PISA studies that were done. PISA is an international testing of student knowledge. In 2006 and then in 2009, Kyrgyzstan performed ranked last on student performance. So it was a scandalization of educational quality in the country. So then what was painted in the news was a crisis scenario about education in the country, a crisis scenario also about teacher shortage, because as you can imagine, if the teaching prospects were 55% of the national average earnings, a lot of people were leaving the teaching profession. So you really did have this dramatic teacher shortage, and also you had a shortage of young people graduating from higher education institutions, pedagogical degrees. Come on in, please. We're trying to be casual here. And so really a crisis scenario was established. And then additionally, there were a number of studies done, the study that you and I were just talking about. There was a study done in 2009 about teacher shortages in the country. There were studies conducted to really understand the situation. And so there was evidence of numbers. And let me show you just a little bit of a film that talked about the situation. It will take about 5 minutes, but I think we can spare it. I'm very proud of this because I had the opportunity to contribute to this research.
The shortage of teachers is a global phenomenon. Worldwide, there is a lack of 13 million teachers. In Central Asia, this problem is considered as a serious barrier to the development of the education system. The first study concerning the lack of school teachers in Kyrgyzstan was conducted in 2009. Later, UNICEF regional offices supported this idea, and a similar study was conducted in 6 countries in Eastern Europe and the CIS in 2011.
В 2009 году по заказу Министерства образования и науки ЮНИСЕФ провел исследование о нехватке квалифицированных кадров. Были рассмотрены несколько факторов, которые влияли на качественный состав педагогического кадра школы. Это система поощрения учителей, то есть аттестации и поощрения, система подготовки учителей, система повышения квалификации и так далее. Из всех этих факторов самым критическим являлся система оплаты труда учителей, которая не стимулировала приток качественных кадров в школу и не поощряла качественную работу учителя.
As in most post-Soviet countries, Kyrgyzstan had a unified wage rate scale, which did not meet current requirements. A fundamental reform of the wage system in Kyrgyzstan's education sector was carried out in 2011. The main objective of the study was to find answers to the following questions. Do teachers earn more than before the reform? 2. Do teachers teach fewer hours than 3 years ago? 3. Is the teacher shortage resolved? 4. Have young teachers been attracted to the profession? And 5. Do schools use the stimulus fund to reward high-performing teachers?
Когда я только пришла в школу, это было в 2009 году, зарплата была очень низкая. Я пришла в школу через 5 лет после окончания университета. Я вообще не планировала работать в школе, но так получилось случайно. Когда я пришла в школу, меня взяли даже не учителя не английского языка, а из-за нехватки учителей в начальной школе взяли учителей начальных классов. Зарплата была очень низкая, где-то до 1000 сомов, где-то 700-800 сомов. И мне пришлось, и в это же время меня пригласили в еще одну школу, учителем английского языка. А мне пришлось работать в двух школах.
The unified wage rate scale was based on teaching load, better known as stavka. The weekly load of a young teacher was the lowest, with a salary of 916 soms per month, and the salary of the teacher holding the highest category was 1,966 soms without additional allowances. According to a regional survey in Eastern Europe and the CIS, the average teacher's salary in Kyrgyzstan was 3,908 soms per month. This is the lowest salary for the other 8 countries in the region, except Tajikistan. Therefore, teachers and the Independent Teachers Union raised the issue of wage increases.
После создания профсоюза первым делом мы решили добиться повышения заработной платы. Потому что заработная плата была очень нищенская. В связи с тем, что в связи с этим учителя должны были подрабатывать. Кто-то на поле, кто-то, у кого есть такая возможность, кто-то открывал магазины в кредит и так далее. Но это была борьба за выживание учителей. Их социальный статус очень был низким, никем не поддерживался, ни профсоюзом, ни правительством.
At the end of 2010, teachers from almost all regions of Kyrgyzstan started organizing rallies. They urged the authorities to increase wages of up to 10 to 15,000 soms a month, the allocation of land for construction of houses, and the provision of benefits to utilities.
Ошол мезгилде бирок теңсиздик болуп калган. Мугалимдердеги бир тобу аз, бөлүктөрдү көбүрөөк болуп калган. Мына мен бир жакшы бир неме айткым келет. Мына буюрку жаңы бийликтин келгени, ошо реформаны жасагандыгы мугалимдер үчүн бир топ ийгиликтердин болуп, чоң ийгиликтердин ачкысы болуп деп айта алам. Мына ошонун натыйжасында айлык аздыгынан, бөлүгүнүн азынан мугалимдер өз митинг 2013 жылдын декабрь айында митингге чыккандыгы анык.
From 2001 to 2007, the average salary in the education sector was increasing annually. For the next 3 years, wages hardly increased. However, after the reform, wages saw a real increase and even exceeded the rate of inflation. However, salaries in the education sector remain below the average wage in the country. Other than people in the agricultural sector, educators are still receiving the lowest salaries.
Необходимость была острая, поправить ситуацию. Рост начинается с роста духовного. И вдохнуть жизнь в школу, дать качественное образование, дать надежды на будущее – это был императив дня. И мы сделали все возможное, чтобы найти те деньги, повысить практически в 3 раза была повышена зарплата учителей. Это был правильный шаг, верный шаг. Это принесло успокоение всему обществу. Все занялись своим делом. И, конечно, мы какие-то вот последние 4 года мы чувствуем результат такого шага. Но инфляция и жизнь берут свое. Сегодня уже стоят другие задачи.
Okay, so this gives you a really good overview of the reform that was taken, why it was taken, what the scenario was beforehand. But I want to dig deeper with you on what exactly that reform was, and to ask a very interesting question, which is, why did it not work? And why is it that in 2011 it was adopted, and now in 2014, and now as I do my research in 2016, we see that it's been largely undone, and actually fascinatingly reverted back to what it was before. So let's dig in, let's take a look. Let me share with you some of the questions that I have. These are what I just mentioned, my emerging questions. Why, despite these well-intentioned goals, was there so much pushback? What happened afterwards? And again, my fundamental question, how is it that teachers and schools undo reforms? So this was the salary structure in the Soviet Union, in Kyrgyzstan, 20 years after the Soviet Union. This is called the Unified Tariff Scale. The situation here, as you can see, is it's highly fragmented. It's a very cumbersome calculation. It's also remarkably unpredictable from year to year, sometimes even from month to month. Teachers don't know how much they're going to get. So here's what the salary structure looked like after the reform. There were three components. One of the main goals was to make it less cumbersome, easier to understand. The three components were the guaranteed salary, they were a compensatory part, and then there was an introduction of a bonus pay, stimulus fund. And the goals were, first and foremost, to attract young teachers to the profession and to indeed raise the salary. But it was also motivated by reducing the number of teaching hours that teachers can take on. Because previously teachers had been teaching 35 up to 40 hours. Their salary was derived from how many hours they took on based on these stavka systems. Yeah? The other goal of the reform was to move away from this, was perceived to be antiquated concept of categories, category, which was an attestation process of what kind of specialist you are. And the idea was to replace this with your education level, with the qualifications that you bring to your job, right? The other was this introduction of bonus pay. Now, bonus pay was not necessarily new because there had always been bonuses, and the Soviet Union was structured on this premia concept, yeah? And for specific events, for things like 8 Marta, whenever there was money in the school budget, it would be allocated to teachers. But this is a formal incentive pay structure. This is a global idea of pay for performance. Yeah? Now, does anyone have any ideas or can speculate on why this was not ultimately a good idea? All of these aspects. Who did this alienate, or who would be most upset by performance pay, elimination of categories, and introduction of education as your main component of salary calculation, and also by not allowing you to teach more than a certain number of hours?
The older teachers.
The older teachers.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. No, in the instance that I'm in my language use of it, no, not a difference there. Yes, absolutely. The people who felt that they were very much overlooked in this reform were the older teachers. It was the older teachers, and we can talk a little bit about why. Let me show you, just so, and this is kind of the giveaway of exactly what happened. And it's not, you can't read it well, I apologize for that, but you actually don't need to read it because it's the color coding here that matters. So, Soviet system, your base salary, your stavkas. On top of one stavka, you get another one. This is all of your teaching hours, yeah? On top of that, you get these categories based on who you are and what your professional experience is. On top of that, you get supplements for things like working in the gymnasia or teaching in a high mountainous region or working in a dangerous class situation like chemistry, yeah? And on top of that, very little bonus pay, maybe, not really percentage calculation. Here's what the reform goal was. This was meant to align the educational structure with the ways that, for example, OECD countries compensate their teachers. You have not a teaching load like the stavka, but a workload. You're working a certain number of hours a week, approximately 20 hours teaching, 12 additional hours or so for other pedagogue-related tasks and other responsibilities of the school, no additional teaching hours. And then you have a compensatory portion because you do need to give some teachers extra funds for in gymnasium teaching extra classes, high mountainous regions, and then an incentive pay up to 20%. So a huge incentive pay structure. Here's what the reform looks like by 2014. And I would argue it looks a lot like this and actually even more exacerbated than it was before. So within 3 years, teachers are teaching 20 hours, so that still remains, but they also have an additional 12 hours of work responsibility, but they're now allowed to teach 11 additional hours. So it came back nevertheless. The compensatory portion turned out to be just 5% of the salary structure, and the incentive pay, this bonus pay, was never made to be 20%, it remained 10%. Yeah? So I'm interested in understanding why this happened, what was it about this reform, and what was it perhaps about the dynamics in schools, processes in schools that really reverted that back to where it was. So again, my research question is, in what ways do entities that experience negative impacts of reform, and we have identified, and my hunch is that it really has been the older teachers, but also, frankly, the administrators who were looking at the structures within schools. How do you have enough teachers who to teach just 20 hours without being able to hire more teachers? And so you revert little by little back to the system where you are. So we have this really interesting conundrum now, which is that the reform is in place and a lot of people consider it successful, but when you look at the school level, it looks a lot like the system that had existed previously. I find it to be really quite a fascinating enigma. My interviews are trying to understand exactly how this is happening at the school level, what's going on, who are the players that made it to be de facto gone. Yeah? So my methodological approach, this is inductive research. I consider this inductive research because I'm working to build a theory and to build an understanding of what this is. I have some hunches, but I am not testing a theory in this instance. I really want to understand from my interviews what's happening here. It is a mixed method of data collection. I am collecting quantitative school level data. I'll show you what that is. I'm doing interviews with school leaders, teachers, parents, policymakers. I have a lot of school observations. I go to school performances all the time. I've got one for veterans on Friday. I'm going tomorrow to apparently where the minister is coming to school. So I'm in the schools all the time. It's very interesting to see what the teachers and what the administrators are telling me. Very often very different things. So my methodology, my data collection, I feel very fortunate. I've been able to get a lot of quantitative data. I have the school, but I'm working on getting school budgets, the certificates from all the schools that I'm doing research in and beyond. So I'm trying to get city data to really understand what does the budget look like? Have principals been able to hire more teachers to incorporate the reform as intended, or is there anything going on in the books that is showing? I mean, essentially, this is budgetary undermining. Teachers are very willing to share things with me, like their vietnamist, their receipts for their salaries, which is pretty cool. I'm looking at this criteria for the stimulus fund, for this bonus pay. Very interesting. There were directives from the ministry on what that should look like. Schools were allowed to adopt and change it as they wanted. Fascinating to see which schools did, which schools didn't, exactly how they did it. Very interesting. So that's, a lot of that is also the documents that I'm collecting, like the stimulus fund criteria. My interviews have taken me, and actually I haven't gotten to do this, and I'd love for your thoughts and observations on this. Who in the community I ought to speak with, who might have insights on essentially power dynamics and the structures of the school, who's interacting with whom in schools, how, to support teachers, to particularly to support the older teachers who felt undermined, but now really my preliminary data analysis is showing that the older teachers who were upset about getting only 20 hours of teaching where they were used to teaching 35 hours are getting more teaching hours, right? Does that mean that younger teachers who come to the schools see that they're not going to be able to make enough money because the older teachers have it and so they leave? And so a lot of questions around the composition of the schools too. This is just my data collection approach and how many people at my sample size. I'm working with 10 schools in Bishkek. I'm working in Bishkek specifically because this study in UNICEF looked at the entire country. I'm interested in Bishkek for a couple of reasons, among which are that for the most part, people have the most choice for employment in Bishkek, so people can leave teaching more easily here and find other opportunities, including, frankly, as teachers have done, work at the market, work in any other sphere. A lot of teachers who come with specialized skills, like speaking English or knowing math really well, are courted by other industries and they leave to do that. I'm also interested in Bishkek because proximally it is closer to power, but in fact, that doesn't mean by any means, in fact, that they are acting or utilizing agency in a political way. I don't think it's political, I think it's sociological to a great extent. Preliminary findings and hunches, just very quickly. As I promised that I would go over, I am doing precisely that. But it's only 4:31, so.
Can I just quickly
Yes.
ask, are these both Kyrgyz and Russian schools?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I, in choosing 10 schools, did purposive sampling, precisely to choose that. I have 4 schools that are specialized. I have 2 gymnasia schools. I have 1 special education school. I have 1 lyceum school. I have a number of schools that are Kyrgyz, a number of schools that are Russian. 2 of my schools are in the outer areas of the city, so in Vostoky. And and yes, indeed, the composition of the schools is different. I picked schools that are good schools, prestigious schools, the schools that I found, one of the only schools that I found that actually is not overcrowded, it's under capacity rather than over capacity. Most schools in Bishkek are severely over capacity, working in 2-3 shifts. I found the one of 2 schools that is not. I can tell you why it's not later if you'd like to know. And in the schools, again, my informants are everyone who's willing to talk to me. So some of my preliminary hunches. So significant unintended consequences of the reform. Things like added paperwork, things like empowerment of school administrators rather than teachers, making teachers highly vulnerable to the dynamics in the school that shape who's on the stimulus fund committee and how it's distributed. The goal was to have some competition between teachers for bonus pay, and yes, that happens, but it's not necessarily in the way that the reform intended. You have a lot of control and micromanagement of teachers because of the various documentations that the reform expected. And then I'm finding, I'm exploring this a little bit, but I think this starts to go maybe more into anthropology than sociology, but intergenerational conflicts, dynamics between teachers who are competing and understanding the norms and the hierarchies therein. So, some of the findings, raising qualifications for teachers can lead to these intergenerational tensions. As I said, the categories were removed. Categories were mostly aiding older teachers to get more salary. And this here was the new structure that aided a lot of the young professionals. So if you have a master's degree, you get a higher salary than if you do not. Well, guess what? In the Soviet Union and thereafter, there were no master's degrees. So it's really quite a problem that's understandably so. How can you reward people for something that most of your teachers never had an opportunity to get, right? And that is very problematic. Schools use whatever leverage or control that they need to arrive at homeostasis or status quo, even if it means undermining reforms. So this notion of having bonus pay for performance does happen. I have seen evidence of this in some schools, but you also have a number of other distribution patterns of this bonus pay. Egalitarian, which is just everyone gets the same and we're not going to mess with this thing at all. We're just going to distribute the money equally because that's fair. Then there's this teacher micromanagement aspect, which is If you do all your forms on time and everything is perfect, then you get a bonus pay. If you do not, you're penalized for it. And then there's a very blatant category replacement, which is whoever was a great teacher because they received these categories, that's who gets it, because that is quality, right? So quite an interesting aspect of this work. I'm not going to talk about this too much because I really do want to leave time for you to comment. But this is a perception question that was part of this 2014 study that I was involved with, which is asking teachers, so who gets the bonus pay at your school? And only 50%, less than 50% said it depends on quality. And some of the other answers were arbitrary, no idea, or older teachers get it. Only 2% said younger teachers get it, even though in the reform conceptualization, the bonus pay was meant to attract young teachers because it's a capitalist model, right? You do well, you get rewarded more. It seems very practical, but in effect it didn't work. I have no idea what this other is. I find that fascinating. I'd love to know more about it. Just as a quick note for you on what these recommended criteria were and why the reform goal itself is contradictory. Here are some of the recommended criteria for bonus pay, and let me note to you, which I did in color here, that quality only appears twice, and it may or may not even be quality. Complexity and intensity of teaching, and methodological work and good lesson preparation. Other things here, oh, and by the way, the one that's most explicitly is preparation of students for Olympiads, which is, I would argue, a very Soviet concept of what education quality is. If teachers participate and engage in preparing students for Olympiads, almost inherently it means that they are focusing on one student or two students at the expense of the others, not student learning, in my very strong but humble opinion. And other things, administrative, professional things that are awarded, but again, as I pointed out a few slides ago, more things like control of teachers, right? Rather than allowing teachers to take initiative to show quality and then rewarding that. So, explaining the case, right, I'm looking at timing of the reform, I'm looking at content, but mostly I'm very interested in the processes of the reform. How is it getting implemented? How is it getting modified? Here are some of my theoretical explorations for analysis. I am, of course, deep in theory, even though, as I said, I'm not attached to a theory yet. But some of the things that I'm considering as far as what may be possible explanations, and these are big theories, right? I think I'll ultimately settle on a little theory, not a big theory. But big theories drive smaller theories. Of course, institutional theories, I'm taking in this instance, an organizational perspective. That semicolon is meant to be an S. Looking at formal and informal structures of schools. So how do schools function as symbolic institutions? What is expected of them? But how are they actually operating in practice? Which, as all institutions do, the main goal is survival and making things work, right? So on the one hand, you have the reform and what you need to do to show that you're implementing it, but how do you actually make things happen on a day-to-day basis? Yeah? I am looking at social capital theory. I'm understanding and trying to gauge what the interactions are like. So I'm looking at things like the relationships formed between peers or bonding. I'm looking at bridging relationships, whether or not people are interacting and coalescing on various hierarchies, so across age or across power lines, so senior teachers with administrators and so on. And I'm trying to gauge how I can look at relationships with outsiders and if the outside community has any impact on what goes on in schools too. Empowerment or disempowerment. I've looked at individual agency and have considered it, but I have not found too many instances of anything like reform agent teacher, which is to say that you've got people in schools who are in some way explicitly working to change reforms, right? There's no one who's pioneering these efforts and kind of calling the ministry and agitating for changes. I haven't really seen that, but I'm not willing to part yet with the concept of agency. My advisor does work on policy borrowing and lending. That is her scholarship, looking at the localization of global reforms. This bonus pay notion is a very global reform. You know, the World Bank loves it. The international community loves it. And it was introduced, by the way, into Kyrgyzstan by recommendation of various international presences in the country. And some other things, theories of social stratification. I've done a lot of work with looking at stratification in countries. Street level bureaucracy, really fascinating to understand how teachers or government employees take it to the streets, right? They're the ones who are actually implementing policy. So questions for you, but really for you to help me. Aid me, please. What resources can I tap into to find out more about salary transition? If you know or are yourself a scholar who understands the stavka system, it is very complicated for me, but my advisor said, you go this time in spring and you have to become an expert. You're going to be our expert on the Soviet teacher education salary structures, so help me. Who else should I be speaking with? Particularly this community question. Am I missing something? Am I misconstruing this case? And also my theories. What theories should I explore here?